Hello, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about. Today I wanted to compare two different streams of atheism. Because currently I'm reading this book. Perhaps you can see or not. It's called The Drama of Atheist Humanism. It's written by Cardinal Henry de Lubac, who was a very important Catholic theologian of the 20th century. He was part of the movement which is called the New Theology. In French, it's probably called Nouvelle Theologie or something like that. He was one of the key thinkers associated with this new movement within Catholicism, I would say. New theological movement, perhaps. The other two were Balthasar and Joseph Ratzinger, who later on went on to become Pope Benedict XVI. So it's an interesting book, and when I was reading it, it struck me as to how different the atheists of the 19th and the early 20th century were compared to their counterparts in the 21st century or the late 20th century. And I was reading his. When we think about European atheism, some of the most prominent names that comes to mind are Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche, and uh, and all three of them were quite eager to understand how the phenomena of religion, or how the need for believing in God emerges in a man's consciousness. So they were quite interested in understanding why is there the concept of God in the first place. So, for example, Feuerbach, and I have those statements in front of me, which I will read from the book. So, for Feuerbach, God is only a myth in which the aspirations of the human consciousness are expressed. Those who have no desires have no gods either. Gods are man's wishes in corporeal form. And he says again, wisdom, will, justice, and love are so many infinite attributes that constitute man's own being, and that nevertheless affect him as if it were another being. Thus he spontaneously projects them beyond himself and objectifies them in a fantastic form, the pure product of his imagination, and to which he gives the name God. In this way he defrauds his own self. The poor man possesses a rich God, or, to be more accurate, he impoverishes himself by enriching his God. He affirms in God what he denies in himself. And lastly, so for Feuerbach, God is essentially the sum total of all the attributes that make that are proper to human nature, right? These are the attributes that we possess, in fact. But according to Feuerbach, the idea of possessing such infinite attributes are so overwhelming that we try to lower ourselves down a bit, lower our own value down a little bit, and try to project those attributes in their fullest form in God. Now, people like Feuerbach, Marx, and Nietzsche, they were not really concerned with the metaphysical arguments about the existence of God. So, they were more interested in understanding how is it that the concept of God has emerged in human societies in the first place, right? And Nietzsche, for example, remarks in one place that it is not even important to indulge in metaphysical arguments, because whenever you try to refute an argument, someone could come up with a better argument. And he gave the example of Kant, who, although he refuted the cosmological arguments about the existence of God, nevertheless, he himself later on had to establish his own ethical system in a transcendent realm. So it was as if the categorical error that Kant made, according to Nietzsche, was that he did not understand that God must be refuted in human mind, because that's where he belongs, and that's where he has to be removed from if God is to be emptied from human societies. And then, but what I find interesting here is that even if you disagree with their criticism, which I do, I don't think it's a very interesting criticism, but still, what you can't really deny is that these people were, although not entirely impartial, but they were still interested in understanding, right? They understood that the religious urge is there and that it has to be addressed. And what they were interested is knowing how our subjective experience of religion is framed, right? How is it? It may be a myth, but how do we associate with that myth? What does it mean to us? So they were really, really interested in understanding the human condition. So for Freud, religion was also an illusion, but Freud also provided a psychological account as to how it exists as a consoling sort of device, to put it in a rather crude manner. And similarly for Marx, again, another individual who was in any sense a fan of religion, but Marx made a very interesting statement, and a very agreeable statement to an extent, even if one doesn't agree with his whole philosophy, is that religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of a real suffering and the revolt against the real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the soul, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of the soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, one may disagree with his analysis, but you understand that he's understanding that religion acts as a opium, as a consoling doctrine, so to speak, to address human conditions which are difficult and which may not even be addressed if religion is not there. So if the illusion of religion is to be destroyed, right, one has to overcome those material conditions that lead us to frame or to believe in God. So again, there's a real focus being put upon man's the relation between a person's mind and his understanding and the emergence of the religious phenomenon. So, and I don't really find that in the new atheistic polemics, right? People like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. They all simply say religions are made, they're false. They never even try to address our subjective experience of that reality, of that experience, of that concept, and which is quite amazing, because Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett actually deny Sam Harris denied that free will exists, and Daniel Dennett has made remarks, has actually said that the subjective human, the consciousness, which is our subjective experience of reality, is actually simply an illusion. So you see that they are engaging in such cop-outs and issuing such statements, which place no importance on our own subjective conditions and our own subjective understanding of certain phenomena. But the person who I find as the most astute critic of Christianity is Friedrich Nietzsche. And again, Nietzsche kind of agrees with Feuerbach on many accounts, but here I think he was a better critic, and he understood, let's say, the novelty of Christianity, because right now what we are seeing, what we have seen since the mid-20th and to this day, the sort of atheism that has become popular, the very evangelical sort of atheism, is that you find that these people take concepts from Christianity and try to ground them on secular grounds, as if these ethics or these values that ultimately come from Christianity are not the inheritance of Christianity, but rather are simply rational values. which anyone can accept by using reason alone. And I find that as a very lame and lazy approach to the subject. And I don't quite understand that these people know what the world was like before Christianity, and what sort of moral grammar that the incarnation and the death of resurrection of Jesus Christ really introduces into human thought, and the very idea that, for example, God himself assumes the form of a slave. How revolutionary that idea is for first century. Or that in Exodus, a God, a transcendent being, says that he has heard the cries of the slaves in Egypt. And who were these people? I mean, from an ancient perspective, slaves were not the concern of a God. But when you read the Old Testament, there is a God who's actually saying that I have seen the sorrow of my people in Egypt. So you find in the Bible, in Judeo-Christian notion of God, that this is a God who pays great deal of attention on the victims, on the sufferers. And just to quote René Girard, he believes, and he has argued quite compellingly, that it's through the Gospels that our concern for the victims has become, the ultimate basis of our values. So even today, we are supposed to be living in a post-Christian culture, at least we claim to be, but still there is an incessant desire for us to create victims, right? And to call ourselves victims just to earn sympathy. That's the easiest way to earn sympathy these days. Not that there is anything wrong with it, but it shows how indebted we are to the Christian idea that the victims deserve to be sympathized with. But if you were to say to a Roman or a Greek that I'm a victim, you must sympathize with me, they probably would laugh it off and say you're just being stupid. But the biblical accounts, they tell us that the victims ought to be sympathized with, and that God sympathizes with the victims, which makes this the very idea of being a victim as some kind of a holy thing, because God himself was a victim, right? So we must side with the victims. Regardless, I think he was right in arguing, as opposed to the contemporary atheists, that if you're really serious about rejecting Christianity or God, then you have to understand that even things that you take for granted, like the quest for truth, justice, even those would become simply false idols that will have no ultimate value in themselves if you reject God. And what strikes me as even more interesting is how he believed that criticism of Christianity should begin not in the ground of the metaphysics, but in the ground of ethics. And he made a very interesting statement, which I will read now, if I manage to find it. Yeah, and he says, look at the way he phrases it. I mean, he was a remarkable writer, quite an astute gentleman, even if one is to disagree with his philosophy, which I certainly do. So he says, up to the present time, the assault against Christianity has not only been faint-hearted, it has been wide of the mark. So long as Christian ethics are not felt to be a capital crime against life, their defenders will have the game in their hands. The problem of the truth of Christianity, the existence of its God, or the historicity of its legend, to say nothing of its astronomy and its natural science, is in itself a very subsidiary problem, so long as the value of Christian ethics goes unquestioned. And he goes on to say, have Christian ethics any value, or are they a profanation and a shame, despite all the sanctity of their means of seductions? That was for Nietzsche the real problem, the only one. Thus, war against the Christian ideal, he cried, against the doctrine that makes beatitude and salvation the aim of life, against the supremacy of the poor in the spirit, the pure in heart, the suffering, the failures. When and where was there ever a man worthy of the nature who resembled that Christian ideal. So what we find here is that Nietzsche is not interested in any metaphysical argument against the existence of God. He believed that that's a kind of a lost cause, because you can always come up with a better argument. I think it's a pretty bad cop out personally, but still, when you look at his criticism of Christianity, right, he's a sort of individual who knows what he's up against. It's not, he did not delude himself with this idea that moral values are somehow, I mean, no theist would deny, for example, that there is in us a natural propensity towards the good. I think there are more reasons to believe that if you're a theist than if you're an atheist or a naturalist, because then how do you account for things like goodness or evil within a naturalistic framework? It seems rather bizarre, as many have argued that we don't have desires, we don't have even free will. Regardless, Nietzsche's criticism is something that I find very compelling, not agreeable, but certainly he was the one who understood the intensity of what he was up against, right? And he did not, entertain this illusion that moral structures, so to say, are not contingent on cultural conditions, and that they are based on our logic convictions about what constitutes as good. So we may have a natural propensity toward good, but how that good unfolds is not simply a matter of abstract or pure rationality, but if you're a theist, would argue that involves God's communication with people, with God's revelation. So, to put it in another word, in another way. So, and he didn't think as if you can preserve the Christian values by simply, grounding them in a secular soil, or trying to preserve them in some form of liberal conscience, because he knew very well that if you actually are of the view that the incarnation is a myth, the idea, if God really did not become human, and if the Gospels are simply lying about this man who was put to death and who was totally innocent, and that he was the very Son of God, and whose death and resurrection ultimately conquered death. If you don't really believe in all that, then why? Then how long do you think you can cherish the illusion that you can hold on to those values that you ultimately derive from those stories or historical facts? Well, depending on which sort of belief you subscribe to. So I think he was quite honest and quite right in asserting that if you remove values from the soils, if you deracinate them from the native soil, then quite obviously one day or another they would themselves corrode themselves and would be supplanted by something else. And the fact that we haven't been able to do so entirely is actually a testament to how strong Christian influence has been on our imagination. And I don't find the New Atheists, right, people like the ones that I mentioned, the Four Horsemen, but even apart from that, others who are claim to be professed philosophers like A.C. Grayling. I mean, I saw his interview with Tom Holland. Well, not an interview, debate, and I think it was shockingly poor. And I mean, if someone has to be an atheist, I have no issues with that, but I think one should always value honesty and truth, and not simply, the pursuit of our own beliefs.